Good afternoon to those of you in Europe and good morning to those of you in the United States. I wish we were convening under more uplifting circumstances, but nonetheless, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second webinar of our special series on nuclear threats and the war in Ukraine. My name is Hanna Notte. I'm a senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I wish to mention upfront before we get started that this event will be recorded. Consistent with our mission at CNS and the VCDNP of promoting non-proliferation education and analysis, we now offer this special series of webinars about the nuclear challenges and risks that have arisen as a result of Russia's unprovoked war against Ukraine. Our discussion today will focus on a topic which all of us, I imagine, until about a week ago, hoped we would never discuss with such urgency and alarm, and that is the risk of nuclear weapons use in the context of the current war. On Sunday, which was the fourth day of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, President Putin ordered Russia's deterrent forces into a special mode of combat duty. In recent days, Russia's Northern Fleet said that several of its nuclear submarines were involved in exercises, and it also appears that units of the strategic missile forces dispersed ICBM launches for exercise purposes, according to the Russian Defense Ministry. In response to these events, the NATO Secretary General called Putin's nuclear alert order dangerous rhetoric, I quote, and a behavior that is irresponsible. And the United States has echoed that sentiment, but has so far refrained from announcing any changes in its own nuclear weapons alert level. And in fact, yesterday, the Pentagon postponed a scheduled ICBM test launch to, I quote, demonstrate that we have no intention in engaging in any actions that can be misunderstood or misconstrued. And then finally, yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Zakharova offered what I initially thought was a somewhat reassuring statement when she suggested that the Russian Federation assumes that the, I quote, apocalyptic scenario of Russia pressing the nuclear button will not be implemented under any pretext or under any conditions. Yet her foreign minister, Lavrov, stated on the same day in an interview that a third world war, should it break out, would be nuclear and devastating. It's against this backdrop that we will discuss today the risks of nuclear weapons use in the context of the current Ukraine war, as well as ways to mitigate such risks. We recognize that this is a highly emotional and frightening topic, especially amid the current debate as to whether Western states should step up their military support for Ukraine and even implement a no-fly zone over Ukrainian skies, which some argue is absolutely necessary at this time, while others caution that this could precipitate escalation with Russia. But that's why we think it's all the more important to have a facts-based and sober exchange on these issues with professionals who have studied nuclear arms control for a long time. Before I'll introduce our speakers, I just quickly want to indicate what types of questions and issues we look forward to discussing over the next 90 minutes or so. We want to understand what Russian nuclear doctrine and Russia's current nuclear posture tell us about the risk of nuclear use. And what did Putin's nuclear alert order really mean in operational terms? What are likely pathways to inadvertent Russia-NATO escalation that could involve a nuclear exchange? Is Russia's deliberate so-called limited use of a tactical nuclear weapon a conceivable option? So what do we know about Russian intentions about so-called escalate to de-escalate? How does the availability of dual capable delivery platforms, so delivery platforms that can carry either conventional or nuclear warheads, how does that shape escalation dynamics amid this current fog of war? And then finally, what institutions, mechanisms, channels, platforms remain available to Russia and NATO to engage in crisis communication and nuclear risk reduction? We are very fortunate to have with us today to discuss these and related questions Dr. Ulrich Kühn, who is the director of the Arms Control and Emerging Technologies program at IFSH Hamburg, and also a non-resident scholar with the Nuclear Policy program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Previously, Uli worked with the VCDNP and also for the German Federal Foreign Office, and he's the founder of the Trilateral Deep Cuts Commission and a former Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow and a prolific writer who has published extensively on these issues. Second, we have with us our own Dr. Nikolai Sokov, who's a senior fellow at the VCDNP. He's a former arms control negotiator for the Soviet and then Russian Foreign Ministry. He participated in negotiations towards the INF Treaty, START 1 and START 2. He holds a PhD from the University of Michigan and the Soviet equivalent of a PhD from the Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences. I would now like to ask both speakers to give a few minutes of introductory remarks, starting with Nikolai Sokov. And again, for those of you who joined late, I just want to remark that this event will be on the record. Nikolai, please.
Thank you, Hanna. Yes, I will try to keep my introductory remarks short and will be ready to amplify any topic during the Q&A session. So Vladimir Putin has invoked nuclear weapons already twice during the ongoing crisis. Furthermore, the Russian strategic forces yesterday have launched an exercise. So all these developments seem quite dangerous, because I must say that we have not seen the use of nuclear weapons for political pressure in the crisis since the 70s, and that really shows the severity of the situation that we live in these dark days. Quite obviously, that behavior is unacceptable. What's perhaps more interesting is that these references to nuclear weapons are not, as I see, okay, so I'll try maybe to speak louder. Yes, I see that there is a remark. It's hard to hear me. Moreover, that behavior does not, in fact, conform to the Russian official nuclear policy. According to that policy, as we know it in the past 20 years, with all the changes and evolution, nuclear weapons are only intended to deter an attack against Russia, whether nuclear or a large-scale conventional attack. And I don't know what's happening. Usually my Zoom works well, as I see that I'm not being heard. Goodness. So anyway, okay, so I'll try to speak even louder. So where was I? So yes, there's never actually been any mention in the past about the possibility of nuclear weapons being used for offensive purposes or to support an invasion of another country and to prevent interference by the international community in that invasion. So that's really quite unexpected development and a very dangerous development. And to make things even worse, such threats were just unnecessary. In my view, there was actually no way that NATO would interfere in that war militarily anyway. That reaction of NATO and the European Union would have been exactly the same as we see it today, regardless of whether nuclear weapons were mentioned by Vladimir Putin. So that policy is wrong, legally, morally, and even in terms of rationality of decision making. So I was asked to give a very short brief on what we're actually facing there, and without going into too many details, that's a complicated subject. Let me just note that the ready-to-use nuclear weapons are strategic missiles, land-based and sea-based. That is based on land in silos or mobile. So those based on submarines, and it's approximately 1,500 warheads. These can be launched, like on a moment's really notice, without any preparation that might be seen from the outside. The rest of nuclear weapons are kept at storage facilities, and to launch them, they have to be released from facilities, transported to military bases. Some of them are close to storages, some further, and loaded onto delivery vehicles. Quite obviously, that activity can be detected from satellites. These constitute probably about 2,000 to 2,500 warheads. Most of them was on long-range cruise missiles, based either on heavy bombers or on submarines or surface ships. Well, there is like a bit like of a challenge there in terms of how you classify them, of course. For example, air-launched cruise missiles legally not classified as strategic, and sea-launched cruise missiles legally classified as non-strategic, although it's exactly the same missiles. The bottom line is the emphasis of Russia is on long-range weapons. I would be probably even slightly more precise. Theater range weapons. That is, from inside Russia, they can reach any target inside Europe. To reach targets in the United States, platforms such as bombers or ships or submarines will have to travel some way so that cruise missiles can reach the United States. So that's kind of the bottom line here. It's about 1,500 strategic warheads that can be launched right away, and probably from 2,000 to 2,500 that will take time to get launched. Now, an important aspect of the Russian strategic posture that's rarely mentioned in the media is the fact that it also includes long-range conventional weapons. Well, that's really the kind of weapons that the United States has possessed and used on multiple occasions since the early 90s. Russia has invested very considerable resources into obtaining them in the past 20 years. It demonstrated the initial capability in 2015, and now has probably several thousand of these weapons. We don't know the exact count, but it's several thousand, definitely. So it's mostly long-range cruise missiles that I already referred to, and they are dual capable. That is, the same missile can carry a nuclear warhead or a conventional warhead. The primary mission of these missiles is in fact conventional. The ability to wage long-range, large-scale kind of conflict without going nuclear. But here we actually have a major kind of challenge, a major uncertainty. Yes, the number of nuclear warheads for these missiles is smaller than the number of missiles. But if, for example, when it comes to a direct military conflict with NATO, Russia launched a number of cruise missiles, NATO will not actually know whether these missiles carry nuclear or conventional warhead. Yes, and well, it's quite possible that NATO will prefer to make a mistake, on the side of caution, and treat them as nuclear and respond accordingly. So that's actually one of the most dangerous escalation paths that I see, that uncertainty about the nature, of strikes, especially the very first kind of use of long-range weapons. What do we know about the warnings that Putin has been giving about high alert status? Not actually much. The language that Putin is actually used is not the standard military language, so we can only guess what he meant. Judging by all signs and everything, well, it's not a lot of high alert. It's mostly a message to the military, stand by in case orders come. So it's not an attempt to go to war footing. It's mostly a procedure that only affects command and control chains and basically enhances the teams at command and control centers, additional people and more attentive kind of status. Also, that is the lowest kind of level of heightened alert. Otherwise, US intelligence community actually leaked information that no preparation for strike could be actually seen. That was the case, I suppose, until yesterday, because yesterday, some part, we don't know exactly which part of Russian strategic force went on exercise, which meant that several submarines apparently left ports, and some mobile missiles actually got dispersed. That's done to enhance the survivability of the force. Such activities actually do indicate an exercise, but given the time, well, it's very hard kind of to see that other than a signal. So plenty of mixed actual messages, nothing too definitive, but at the same time, the atmosphere becomes more and more tense here. That said, there's been no information about the transfer of nuclear weapons from storages to military bases. Yes, and that's a good sign, meaning that we cannot yet actually see any preparation for the use of some variety of non-strategic weapons. The US the reaction of the United States has actually been quite restrained and measured. The initial statement of the Strategic Command clearly indicated that the United States was following events and that the US posture was adequate. A nice, actually, term to indicate that Stratcom took note of Russian activities and statements, but is avoiding tougher language to keep the situation under control. Yes, and you already mentioned, Hanna, that the test launch of an ICBM was postponed. So far, the only good news is the existence of a direct communication channel between the United States and Russian militaries. General, well, the chairman is, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, to Chief of General Staff of Russia, Gerasimov. That's actually very good news. They've been in touch before. They maintain contact, and in many ways, that line of communication is actually more valuable than the hotline between presidents. So after all, it's the military who really control weapon in the end. But in the past, it was in fact the discipline and the commitment of the military that prevented the loss of control over nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union was breaking apart. And we can only hope that this channel and similar discipline and commitment by the military could help avoid excessively dangerous steps, misperceptions, and miscommunication. And my final remarks will be about arms control. So dialogue has been discontinued. That's actually quite a sad term to me, because last time I heard that term was in the fall of 1983, when arms control negotiations were also discontinued. Yes, and that was actually the time of probably the worst crisis between the East and the West since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Quite a tense and dangerous time. I don't remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was only 4 years old then, but I remember extremely well 1983, and it was a bad time. So it's once again discontinued. When it might resume, no one really knows, of course, so anyone's actually guess. Yes, on the one hand, arms control is to the benefit of everyone, the East and the West, the entire world. Yes, on the other hand, of course, it's very hard to pursue that dialogue in the present atmosphere. Well, really critical to the prospects of arms control is the question that no one seems to be seriously contemplating at the moment. What will happen to Russia after this war is over? So how the war will end, what the post-war actually period will be, because actually Russia might actually win the war but lose the post-war actually kind of situation. Yes, at the same time, yes, it might actually lose the war too. So, so really no good kind of consequences of that aggression for Russia. But what exactly happens afterwards, we don't know. And depending on the Western plans for Russia, the policy that NATO and the European Union will pursue toward Russia, will know what arms control might look like and whether there'll be any arms control at all. And I do actually think that it's vital to start seriously contemplating that future post-war and post-Putin, to be honest. NATO and the European Union will need to address the likely gap between the desirable and the achievable. So without knowing what's going to happen, in the next months, probably a year, we cannot really seriously discuss the prospects of arms control. That's actually sad, because before the invasion, looked for arms control seemed quite good and quite positive. We saw the emergence of the forward-looking agenda not just the strategic stability dialogue, but also the possibility of a new INF treaty, whole package of confidence building measures. And now we lost it all. So let's see what the future will hold for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai. Thank you very much. Uli, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much. First of all, thanks to CNS, to Hanna Notte and Bill Potter in particular. You guys, are you hearing me? All right, good. So Nikolai just said it. These are indeed really dark times, and we keep hearing that this is a watershed moment for European and I think also for global peace and security. And I do think that such dramatic sounding assessments are just right. And one cannot overstate the severity of events unfolding in front of us. As some of you might know, I published a piece on inadvertent escalation risks a couple of days ago with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in the early hours of the Russian invasion. And I think I have to be a bit self-critical here, as with all pieces that are being written while events are unfolding, early takes on the war always contain some element of a hot take. And we all need to be careful in our assessing the situation. At the same time, I think it is part of our job as nuclear analysts and scholars to inform the public and the policymakers and try to shed a bit of light at the famous fog of war. In my opening remarks, I want to talk about the risk of escalation, meaning deliberate, inadvertent, and or accidental escalation. Again, a note of caution here, talking about these issues and a warning of certain scenarios is already inadvertently part of the Russian playbook for war, because the more we warn of certain scenarios, particularly nuclear ones, the higher the chance that fear is being spread and the less inclined Western governments might be to take decisive action against the Russian aggression. Then again, as I just said, not knowing about the risks involved in certain Western policy responses could produce unwanted outcomes. Thus, I think we need to be aware of certain risks. We need to weigh them. We need to make sure we limit the potential for inadvertent escalation and, well, in the end, formulate policies accordingly without simply backing down. So indeed, this is a very fine line to walk, and it's a difficult call to make. In order to get our heads around what might unfold in the coming hours, days, and weeks, I think it's important to start from this point. The danger of nuclear use in this war is still rather low. It is, however, not zero, and it is unfortunately real. I deem it necessary to differentiate here between two levels of possible escalation. On the one hand, tactical, and on the other, strategic. Now, at the tactical level, a whole range of potential escalation risks arise from the sheer proximity of NATO and Russian forces now that the war is raging on the alliance's border. I'm sitting here in Hamburg, it's slowly getting dark, and you just fly 2 hours and you're in Ukraine. So that's really close. Now, here are just 3 scenarios that I would like to share with you. Spoiler, of course, there are many more. The first one is an unintentional airborne incident. We could see a violation of NATO airspace by Russian aircraft, an attempt of a peaceful escort out of alliance area is being misinterpreted by the Russian side. This is what's usually going to happen. Normally, NATO aircraft escort the Russian planes out of the airspace, but let's just realize here the Russian pilots might be under severe battle stress. They might misinterpret the moves by NATO aircraft in that regard. You probably heard the latest news about a missing Romanian fighter jet. I still think it's still not clear yet what happened to that fighter jet. There were latest news about 4 Russian aircraft violating Swedish airspace, though obviously that's not NATO territory. And though it seems to me that that was probably rather intentional from the Russian military. The second scenario unfolding could be that Western weapons deliveries come under fire from the Russian side. NATO troops are then drawn into that firefight and we end up in a shooting war between NATO and Russia. There have already been reports of Russian cruise missile use very close to the Polish border in the very early hours of the war that were setting up alarms on the Polish side. And the more the weapons deliveries increase in the coming days, the more the Russian army takes control of the western border of Ukraine, the more I see the risk here of escalation increasing in such a scenario. The third scenario that I would like to share with you is that Ukrainian soldiers or perhaps foreign volunteers are trained on NATO territory, then they cross the border to Ukraine. During the border crossing, they get into a firefight with the Russians. NATO troops are perhaps drawn into that firefight. And you might say, but well, that's not really the case right now, but there was already an announcement from the US that there is a possibility and there are plans to train Ukrainian volunteers on NATO territory. Plus, of course, there's the possibility of Western prisoners of war being captured by the Russians, being paraded on Russian TV, or perhaps their bodies shown. And this will increase calls in the West to do something. And I'm concerned of that something. And I think it's really something that we need to think through. Now let's move to the strategic level. Here, I think it is already enormously difficult to balance the humane and justified desire to prevent further Russian atrocities against the risks of an even greater war, including the possibility of nuclear use. The German government's decision, along with other EU and NATO partners, to supply certain weapons to Ukraine, and that was just enforced today, Germany will send more weapons, increases the pressure on Putin, and that is, after all, as I understand it, what is intended. However, this also increases the danger that Putin might escalate to nuclear use the longer the war lasts and the stronger the economic pressure on Russia becomes. And one should not forget the fact that Putin probably links this war directly with his own fate and with his future historical legacy. And this personal side to the war, and others have pointed to that. I think Sam Charab wrote a really good article in the Financial Times a couple of days ago. So this personal side to the war is very important when weighing the risks, precisely because we're dealing with an isolated autocrat who is unlikely to receive any opposition from the inner Russian circle. So at what point and by what means of what signals could things really get serious? I think Nikolai talked about this a little bit, so I'm just going to try to make this short here. Again, I think we have to distinguish between the nuclear strategic and the nuclear tactical level. What are possible strategic nuclear signals? Larger number of Russian nuclear submarines leaving ports, visible activities at long-range bombers, that is, or meaning the loading of nuclear weapons. Of course, this will have to be watched closely through satellite images, but as we know, satellites only can see as far as there are no clouds there. The dispersion of road mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles that are normally kept in garages. And the signal recipient in that regard would clearly be the United States. Now, what could be possible tactical nuclear signals? That would be transfer of tactical warheads from the central storage sites that are known to the West, and their transfer to the appropriate military units that have the respective delivery systems, meaning short and medium range missiles, fighter jets, sea-based units. And the signal recipient here, I think, would be less clear. would probably mainly be Ukraine, but could possibly also be European NATO allies, for instance, Germany, could perhaps also point to the Russian willingness to escalate to a demonstration strike over an uninhabited area, such as the Baltic Sea or perhaps the Black Sea. Now, what can be done or what should not be done under any circumstances? Again, let us differentiate between the two levels, the tactical and the strategic levels. At the tactical escalation level, I think it is of high importance to prevent possible unintended military incidents at sea and in the air. And I think it would be really important that the sides would quickly agree on practical mechanisms to minimize risk. What would that mean in concrete terms? Well, adherence to professional airmanship at all times, use of specific communications frequencies, or even the establishment of a ground-based communications line. And there are certain lessons here, I think, that we could learn from the agreement between the United States and Russia over Syria, even though that case is not comparable to what we're seeing right now. But some of the mechanisms here could perhaps help. At these times, it is also especially important to have constantly open military-to-military channels between Russian and NATO militaries to prevent or help resolve unintended incidents quickly once they happen or in case of doubt. In turn, the NATO military on the Ukrainian border should be particularly careful not to cross into Ukrainian territory during the physical movement of Western weapon supplies or during possible future training of Ukrainian volunteers, thus giving Russian troops an excuse to escalate. Therefore, EU and NATO member states must closely coordinate on the form and practical implementation of arms deliveries. And my feeling here is, from what I read from Brussels, is that NATO countries are actually quite good at coordinating, but it seems that the EU is not. At least the public messaging, or some of the public messaging of the EU seems to be quite concerning in that regard. National go-it-alones in military support of Ukraine must be prevented. NATO troops must not intervene directly in the war. And that leads me to Ukrainian calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Obviously, I think that is understandable from a moral point of view, but let's face it, it would have to be fought for and enforced by NATO, perhaps including on Russian territory. So from NATO's point of view, this is not a question, this is not in the cards, and it's probably a terrible idea if we consider the potential for escalation that it would entail. So let's now move finally to the strategic escalation level. What could be done there? I think it's pretty clear that we urgently need to identify possible off-ramps for Putin and for Russia. Whether he wants to take those is another question. First of all, the West, I think, must quickly agree on its strategic goals. That is, which results of the war are acceptable to us? Which results do we want to prevent? Based on this, which means do we want to use for this purpose? In my opinion, an urgent task would be for the West to agree on the specific conditions under which sanctions could be withdrawn, and perhaps withdrawn quickly. This is an old problem described since decades in the literature on sanctions. If you do not link your sanctions to an acceptable outcome, thus making it possible for the other side to change its behavior and get rewarded for it, then the other side does not know whether at all it is possible to escape the effects of sanctions. Let me pose a question here also to our audience. Should economic and financial sanctions, for example, be withdrawn immediately if Russia agrees to a ceasefire and withdraws from Ukraine? What exactly would withdrawal mean here? Pre-2014 or pre-February 2022? What about the legitimate issue of reparations to Ukraine? I think while we should and must discuss these issues in the West, one thing is clear. It is not up to us to decide what is or is not acceptable to Ukraine. However, it is up to us to agree on our strategy and the instruments associated with it. And honestly, I don't know how it is for you guys in the US. From European leaders, I don't hear much about this. Last but not least, the US could further support a possible diplomatic off-ramp strategy with arms control measures and could quickly put into actions its December 2021 offer to Moscow to start talks about missile defense being deployed in Eastern Europe and a possible reciprocal INF regime, meaning a new INF regime. I think such talks should then start immediately, but obviously that's a follow-on question to the larger strategic question of how to get out of the war. One last point, of course, all of this would have to be in line with our policy of providing sound military reassurance to our Eastern allies, because they are afraid and they deserve it. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your interest and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Uli, for this very comprehensive overview. I think there are a lot of points in your remarks that will stimulate an interesting discussion and questions from the audience. Before I turn it to the audience for questions, and we already have Bill Potter raising his hand and individuals writing in the Q&A function, I do want to ask two quick questions to both of you. And I would ask for sort of relatively brief responses so that we can get to many questions in the 45 minutes that remain. I do want to come back for Nikolai to this notion not of unintended use or use that arises out of an unintended inadvertent escalation, but intentional use. Nikolai, what do Russian military strategists and Russian nuclear doctrine assume about the viability of limited use? So the idea that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon in conflict for the purpose of Russia unequivocally messaging that it's really willing to go all the way to achieve its strategic and political goals in a conflict. So does Russia assume, from all we know, that limited use can indeed stay limited without escalating to a strategic exchange? So it comes basically to this question of whether Russian military planners really believe that escalating to de-escalate is viable. Do Russia and the West conceive differently of escalation ladders? That's my question to you. And then Uli, right afterwards, can you talk just a little bit about what this current situation, this drastic watershed moment means, in your opinion, for European countries, for European defense policy going forward? We had this seminal speech by Chancellor Scholz in the Bundestag on Sunday with the announcement of a new defense fund with $100 billion US. Lots of discussions happening here in Germany and other European capitals. What's your take on this? Nikolai, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can. Although that's actually a very, very big question that you asked. Now, there isn't a good question. I'm sorry. There isn't a good answer to that question at the moment because, as I already said, that the threat with nuclear weapons under the current scenario is not something that was contained, in Russian official policy. Or for that matter, in analytical kind of papers, including by the Russian military. Also, it's not easy to give a good answer, but generally speaking, the idea has been that in case of a large-scale conventional attack, actually Russia might resort to a nuclear strike on a limited scale. Tailored deterrence, fundamentally, yes, but tailored deterrence, and in fact, in Russia, the term was coined even before it was coined in the United States. That policy continued for some time, although it's never been officially recognized. Okay, so official parlance never included the term de-escalation, although it was quite actually clear that's exactly what was meant. That continued until 2014. In 2014, the Russian military doctrine included the notion of conventional deterrence. So right now, the idea is if Russia is attacked, it will first actually resort to long-range conventional weapons. And only in case of a major defeat, it could still actually go nuclear. So yes, that's the official policy. Once again, we're out of that kind of realm right now, so it's quite unpredictable. Our final point is about tactical nuclear weapons. I strongly believe that the whole idea that limited nuclear use would be with tactical short range, let's put it like that, nuclear weapons is a mistaken idea. For the past 20 years, they've been quite actually consistent that reliance is on long range, theater range and strategic range actually assets. And that actually makes a lot of sense because usually since 1991, the United States and NATO, when they resorted to military power, emphasized long-range conventional weapons. Also, to get to the basis from which, for example, aircraft fly, you also need long-range assets. So yes, I would really kind of forget about the tactical, well, meaning short-range kind of side of things. The shortest range asset that Russia might actually use is Iskander. That's 500 kilometers, but all the rest are much, much longer range.
Thank you, Nikolai. Uli, you want to take it away?
Sure. So what does all that mean for the so-called European peace and security order? First of all, a couple of colleagues from the US, from Western Europe, but also including from Russia and also Ukraine, have pointed out throughout the last couple of years that the job is not done. Meaning the job that the US thought it was done for Europe, Europe whole and free, to quote George Bush Sr. here, because there was a country in Europe that clearly felt it had no place in the European security architecture, at least not anymore since the beginning of the new millennium, and that being Russia. And now we have a country that has broken all the rules, that has devalued documents like the Helsinki Final Act or the OSCE's Charter of Paris from 1990. So what does that mean? I mean, where are we going in the next couple of years? And hopefully, we don't know how this war will end. There are certain scenarios here. I think none of them is good. But let's assume that this war at some point ends without drawing us all into a nuclear catastrophe, hopefully. I think that we're going to see a huge return of containment policy all over Europe. I think we're going to see a massive remilitarization of Europe, something akin to a new Iron Curtain will probably fall down, but more to the east than it was during the Cold War. We will see a number of frontline states, including the 3 Baltic states, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, perhaps Finland. I do think that there is quite a possibility in the next couple of months that we might see at least Sweden apply for NATO membership, perhaps also Finland. Then let's look at Germany. For Germany, clearly that was a wake-up moment. Germany has, during the last couple of days, broken with a lot of its traditions. It's emphasizing economic politics over security politics, I think, is not viable anymore when we look to the near and midterm future. I would be careful to overestimate the 100 billion euros that Chancellor Scholz announced for the Bundeswehr, because Germany had already spent more than 50 billion euros per year on its armed forces, and it was getting out nothing. So no bang for the buck. And that was clearly a question of bad bureaucracy and bad management. So I would have loved the German forces first to take a closer look at why are we not getting tanks that are driving or ships that are sailing for the money, but instead now we're just pouring a lot of money into that sinkhole. We'll see what comes out of that, but I'm rather skeptical in that regard. And of course, at the human dimension, I mean, today I read that the first Ukrainian refugees arrived here in Hamburg. We know that already around 1 million have crossed the borders to various European member states of the European Union. We're going to see many more refugees. We're going to see more volunteers flowing in from the western border to Ukraine. And we know from historical examples that those irregular forces involved in combat, once they return, will bring a lot of problems. So for societal peace in Western European countries, this is really, really a bad sign. So Europe is in for at least a decade of really troubled waters if nothing changes in Moscow itself.
Thank you so much for that, Uli. I do want to turn it over to the audience because I recognize that we just have a bit over half an hour and probably a lot of interest. I'll pass the floor to Dr. Bill Potter first, but I also want to indicate to our audience that if you wish to ask a question, you can write it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can also raise your hand if you wish to ask the question live, and we can unmute you if you wish to speak. Bill?
Thank you so much, Hanna and Uli and Nikolai, for your both eloquent but also exceptionally sobering remarks. And you raised so many dangerous, kind of dismaying scenarios that I'm hesitant to add another to the mix. But I've been struck by the, as best I can tell, absence of much cyber activity by the Russians in particular. And I think particularly, Uli, in terms of your, your different escalation scenarios, cyber is another dimension that merits some attention. I was kind of struck listening to the radio this morning about these stories that there are non-governmental hackers in the US who have been talking about mobilizing to target Russia. And I don't know the degree to which they would have capabilities or how this might be regarded by the Russians, what they could actually do. But it seems to me that the issue of non-governmental orchestrated cyber attacks is something that could be of concern. And then more generally, the question of a change in terms of restraint on both sides with respect to cyber is something we also have to take account of. So I'd be interested particularly in your comments, but also Nikolai, if you'd like to make them.
Thank you, Bill. Who would wish to tackle that question? Uli, do you want to?
Sure. Excellent question, Bill. And I'm very much concerned about what's going on in the cyber realm. I just didn't want to overload my presentation with my own personal concerns, but here's what has happening during the last couple of hours. So, for instance, France has confirmed that there was a suspected cyber attack against Viasat, which is a satellite that is used for commercial streaming. So that's not that bad, but at the same time, hacktivist groups and Western motivated hacktivist groups appear to have started targeting the Russian GLONASS system, which is the Russian equivalent to GPS. And as far as I know, but Nikolai is the better expert here and he might correct me, I think that the Russian military, at least certain conventional elements, are also using GLONASS. So an attack on the GLONASS system would be an attack on the Russian military. It would be an attack that one would not be able to attribute. Was that really a Western group? Was that a Western group that was being organized by someone or directed? Did they do that out of their own motivation? It would not be clear at all. And I think we've seen the warning from the Russian ministry that just said, we consider every attack on our satellite system as an act of war. And this is something where I'm really, really concerned, because it's this gray area where no one really knows who is active, from where, what's their motivation. And usually it takes really good experts a couple of weeks to sort out who was responsible for what. We won't have the time if something serious happens in cyberspace.
Thank you, Uli. Nikolai, did you want to add anything?
Just a few words, really. So I fully agree with what Uli said. I would only add that I don't think there will be a lot of doubt with the Russian military about attribution. They will not try to decide whether it's a government or a non-governmental actor. Well, in all actual likelihood, they will just attribute to the government. And as I say, I agree, that's actually quite a dangerous activity. How to it bear? I understand the motivation, but I don't think that non-governmental actors or even individuals fully think through possible consequences of their actions.
Thank you for that, Nikolai. I do want to turn to a question in the chat, which, with your permission, Uli, I'll address to you. There's a question here that says the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian diaspora have done a very successful job of winning global public opinion. To what degree does public opinion play a role in any escalation spiral, particularly for the use of no-fly zones in Western Ukraine or the direct involvement of NATO special forces? From you observing, the mood in Germany and other European countries, do you think that that could play into an escalation spiral?
Yeah, I think that's really an excellent question. Let me just make 2 points here. I mean, one thing that I think, at least for me, was so far really surprising was how bad the Russian efforts on social media were so far. I mean, we have heard all that stuff about Russia being active in the gray zone war and how successful they are with their messaging and their narratives. I just don't see it. I even have a feeling that Russian bots are not very active so far. And so when it comes to winning the war on social media, and that affects obviously a lot of the public opinion these days, I would say that's something that Ukraine and the West so far has won. The second point is, and that was something that I alluded to in my remarks, is that what is new here is that this is a war that is almost playing out in real time if you follow social media. You can see all these little video clips from Russian tanks, from the bombardment in Kharkiv and whatnot. And obviously that is affecting the public opinion a lot because people are drawn into that. It's like watching a terrible movie, but in real time. And my impression is that we see a mix of fear in Europe about what is to come, but I think that we're going to see increasingly a lot of anger and a lot of people asking their governments to what I refer to do something. And that pressure will mount in the next couple of days and weeks, the more that Russia turns to the tactics of bombarding civilian quarters of Kharkiv and Kiev, the more we see pictures of atrocities being committed. And that will increase the pressure a lot on Western governments. And I think they will have to be really cool-headed and steadfast in not giving into the public pressure to do something, because what is that something? Again, we need to think from the very end. What is it that is acceptable for us? What is it that we want to avoid? And from there on, we need to develop a strategy.
Thank you for that, Uli. Nikolai, did you want to add something to that question?
Oh, yes, a little bit. One is, we already actually seen that experience, with the active media, yes, and that was the war in Vietnam, which was actually conducted, well, maybe not completely live, but very close to that, and quite obviously it affected the United States very strongly. Two, well, there was an interesting actually discussion at one point. Just imagine that the Cuban Missile Crisis were evolving in the presence of social networks. Well, just whole idea, would it be actually resolved or not? So we just need to understand kind of the potential for escalation there that no one really wants, but it just happens, sort of. Three, the negative side of social media is incredible actual number of fakes. Plenty of people and organizations are trying to assess them, and identify fakes, but it's very hard to do, and usually it's too late. So I think just everyone who is watching news on social media just should be aware that not everything that they see is true. And four, I don't know about that for sure, but there is to a degree some censorship. So it's actually, well, it's possible that Russian bots are not very active, not because they chose to, but because they're not given an opportunity. Yes, there is also other explanation. In fact, the Russian authorities do not really want to escalate the situation kind of further. So to some degree, they actually might be trying kind of to step kind of back and on not elevate the emotions any further.
Thank you for that, Nikolai. I would now like Bitgood, who's the director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation program at CNS in Monterey, California, to unmute yourself, because Sarah has done work on US-Soviet nuclear arms control and nuclear risk reduction, and maybe she can share some thoughts to what extent history can offer any lessons for dealing with the current situation. Sarah.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks for such a great conversation with Uli and Nikolai. Yeah, Hannah, I'm happy to offer some thoughts about kind of what I think the historical record can teach us here. And, for me, I think one of the most important lessons from looking at this historical record is that, we can't assume that just because there is what looks to us like a nuclear close call or invocations of these kinds of nuclear saber rattlings that we've been talking about here, that there will be policies implemented in place in response to those kinds of events after the fact. And in fact, I think we kind of know from looking at history that this depends on a lot of other factors. Nikolai was talking about the 1983 war scare. We talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think there are considerations about the ways that, leaders view the utility of different approaches for mitigating risk prior to a crisis happening, the extent to which they attribute the crisis to specific factors, their own perceptions of nuclear risk, before a crisis happens, during the time of a crisis itself, and their own kind of views on the likelihood that there could be other such events in the future, maybe with less sanguine outcomes. Those are all considerations that influence the policies that they implement after the fact. And so, I think it's also worth bearing in mind as well that sometimes the ways that people respond to a crisis, and if they think that they have responded effectively to a crisis because it does not escalate to nuclear use, that can reinforce the view that existing policies work well, and that can actually dissuade, policymakers from implementing approaches that might in the future be useful for reducing risk. And so, that's just kind of a note of caution here, that not that anybody is suggesting this, but I think there's sometimes a conventional wisdom that if there is a close call or some kind of event that is approaching nuclear use, that there will then be policies implemented in the aftermath of that event that can prevent such things from happening in the future. And I don't think we can readily assume that. Hanna, if I can add one more note, not to just abuse my prerogative as a member of the audience here, but I think there are some interesting lessons to be learned too from kind of reviewing existing risk reduction measures. One of those is, I've done a lot of work on some of these détente era agreements, like the 1973 agreement on the prevention of nuclear war. That was an agreement that was negotiated in a very, unusual political situation, because you had the Nixon administration trying to make inroads with China, trying to rebuild relations with Europe. And it really watered down the extent of an agreement that they could negotiate with the Soviet Union that wouldn't make those various parties feel threatened. And so I think there are kind of political considerations here as well, in addition to lessons about what is actually effective in practice from a risk reduction standpoint versus agreements that codify rules of the road or are sort of more designed to encourage responsible behavior. And those don't always work in practice in the ways that we might assume, or in ways that might be effective. So that's just kind of amplifying some of the points that I think Uli and Nikolai in particular already made about, the utility of mill-to-mill communication and things like that. Thanks, Hanna. Thanks for the chance to weigh in.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that. I do see Professor Cohen's hand up. Professor, do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a comment and a question to just a second. It's a question and a comment to both Nikolai and to Ulrich. Many of us were shaped in the last 20 years by a lot of conversation about the nuclear taboo and the tradition of non-use. Good studies that were made by Tenenweld and by TV Poll and others. And many of us believe that at least in the Western side, there is a tradition, possibly by now a norm, about a certain kind of taboo. Very little was done on the Soviet side, the Arshid side. And I wonder what Nikolai and possibly Ulrich would like to say, how much that applied to the situation today and to the doctrine in general. The related question is to what extent the notion of a demonstration, nuclear demonstration, is a step before actual nuclear use on the tactical side, on the Russian doctrine, military doctrine. Thank you very much.
Nikolai, would you like to address that comment and question?
Oh, okay, yes, I'll try. Well, there is a nuclear taboo. Yes, I'm actually quite firm. I quite firmly believe in it. Yes, and that's why the veiled actually threats with nuclear weapons, possibly with nuclear weapons, all right. Yes, and Putin can always say that he meant strategic conventional, but possibly with nuclear weapons. That's why they are so dangerous, because they give kind of nuclear weapons not more legitimacy, but more usability. Yes, you can try now to employ them for political ends, and that's not a good idea. That said, the other side will also see more utility in nuclear weapons, I think, because well, it will perceive that my nuclear weapons actually do deter the other side from going to full-scale aggression and things like that. So I think the non-use norm is still there, but the utility of nuclear weapons will probably, the perceived utility of nuclear weapons will probably somewhat increase. Yes, and that's not very good news. Oh, absolutely, yes. Oh, that's not good news. So one of the consequences, I think, that's going to be the next actually seminar that CNS holds, but one of the consequences might actually be a wider rift between nuclear and non-nuclear states. Nuclear states might actually see more utility, and non-nuclear states will almost definitely see nuclear weapons as more dangerous than seemed even just a week ago.
And I would add, Nikolai, perhaps enhanced value of nuclear weapons, not just for deterrent purposes, but actually for coercing and compelling an adversary. I think this is what we're seeing in the present situation, and that can have ramifications for how actors in other regions, whether that's the Middle East, for instance, or other regions, look at the utility of a nuclear weapons program, which is very concerning. Nikolai,
yes,
did you want to say something?
I fully agree with that.
Sure, go ahead.
Just a two-finger to add here, you already mentioned actually one more consequence there is that official public policy, nuclear policy, will be less actually trusted, definitely Russian, but also public policy of other nuclear states.
Uli.
And I wanted to point out one thing. There has been a wonderful book published a couple of years back by Todd Saxor and Matt Foreman on coercive nuclear threats. And the argument they make there is that coercive nuclear threats are not much of use. And I think they collected quite a lot of data points. So far, this crisis proves their point, because Putin made a rather explicit but still rhetorical nuclear threat. In response, the West decided to enact the strongest sanctions ever on Russia. Then Russia made another explicit nuclear threat when raising the alert level. In response, Turkey closed the Dardanelles and Bosporus Strait for certain Russian ships. So and Nikolai referred to the very muted and calm reaction on the US side. So far, they seem to be right. My problem here is that a game that we're now going to play for the next couple of days and weeks and just raise the bars and raise the bars? I just don't want to end up at the point where Saxor and Foreman would have to write a new conclusions chapter, if you get what I mean.
Thank you very much for that, Uli. And I do want to pick up on one phrase that Nikolai just mentioned. Statements by the Russian government on nuclear policy will not be trusted so much anymore in the future, given what just happened, which brings us to the issue of declaratory policy. And for those in the audience who are not familiar with the term, declaratory policy is defined as a set of public statements about the circumstances in which a state would consider using nuclear weapons. Now, it was just a few weeks ago that Russia joined the other 4 permanent members of the UN Security Council in affirming that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Yet here we are just weeks later with President Putin threatening, not so subtly, that he might go to the nuclear escalation level. So what, in your view, does this present crisis mean for the future of declaratory policy, for the value of signaling intentions, and for the reliability of declaratory policy, also as we're still awaiting the United States nuclear posture review? I don't know who wants to come in on that. Nikolai, I see you nodding.
Oh yeah, I can do. Yes, trust in declaratory policy of Russia will be undermined, and that's exclusively actually the fault of Putin. And moreover, he already actually said that that invoking nuclear weapons was actually quite useless. Yes, it was not needed, in fact. I don't agree with Uli that certain things were done by the West in response to these kind of statements. I think these decisions would have been taken anyway. So invoking nuclear weapons is actually counterproductive. Yes, that's what the crisis has demonstrated. But the simple fact that these actually threats were made, even though not very direct, but sufficiently transparent, will yes undermine our trust in the Russian declaratory policy, but to some extent everyone else's. And that's not a comfortable actual situation when you don't know whether you should take official statements seriously. Well, it's not a comfortable situation for the entire world when you don't exactly know how this or that nuclear state will behave in different contingencies. Well, it's actually been a big achievement over decades and decades that we begin to trust declaratory policies, yes, and use them for analysis of planning and prediction. Yes, it would be quite sad if we lose that tool for analysis and prediction.
Uli, did you want to say anything further on that question?
I just quickly want to add to what Nikolai said, because he made all the important and relevant points here. I mean, let's face it, words matter. Words matter also in international politics. This is not something that we should just treat lightly. And in that regard, what is it that the Russians would want us to tell in the future that we should believe? This will be extremely, extremely difficult to come back to at least a modicum of trust in the future.
Thank you for that, Uli. We have 10 minutes left, so I do invite the audience to post questions or raise their hand if you wish to ask a question. In the meantime, I'll read out a comment by Jeff Knopf in the chat box. He says that in addition to whatever might be demonstrated about utility or a lack of it of nuclear weapons, the situation is also devastating to a key non-proliferation tool, security assurances. The Budapest Memorandum has completely collapsed, so why would any nuclear proliferator believe future promises that their security will not be put at risk if they give up the bomb? Not sure, Uli or Nikolai, whether you want to address that comment.
Well, I'll say a few words, but that's really something for a much longer conversation. But very briefly, Ukraine did have physical control of nuclear weapons, but did not have the ability to use them. And they were massive, I would say, insurmountable economic, political, financial, and other challenges to overcome toward Ukraine's indigenous nuclear capability. I know about statements that Ukraine would have become a full-scale kind of nuclear power without the Budapest Memorandum. I strongly believe that's a romantic actual view. So it's whole different. I'm sorry. One more participant here. So yes, that's basically the answer.
Thank you for that, Nicola. I don't see any further questions from the audience, so maybe I'll pose a final question to both speakers. And some of you have already addressed institutions, platforms to some extent, but I do want to come back because it's quite a central question. Russia and Western countries had over decades negotiated a range of nuclear arms control and also risk reduction treaties. We've lost a number of those in recent years, whether that's through negligence, non-compliance by a party, or outright withdrawal. So we're not left with much at present. So really, which guardrails do we have today that can help us prevent nuclear escalation? And through which platforms, mechanisms, and channels can Russia and NATO countries communicate in crisis to manage escalation risks?
Yeah, perhaps let me quickly come in here. So yeah, what is still left? So obviously we still have the New START Treaty, which is generally a treaty about restraint. I wouldn't call it a disarmament treaty, but it's a clear arms control treaty. It limits the number of strategic US and Russian warheads and delivery vehicles, provides for information exchange, certain notifications. Clearly, the last really standing full-fledged nuclear arms control treaty that we have, and Dmitry Medvedev has already hinted at it that well, perhaps in response to the Western politics, Russia has or should get out of that treaty. So of course that would be terrible, terrible. What else do we have? We have the INCSI and DMA agreements. The incidents on the high sea and dangerous military activities agreements, those are bilateral Russian-US risk reduction measures, leftovers from the Cold War. The problem is those agreements, which are really important, they're only bilateral. And I think, and I pointed to that in my remarks, we have a gap here. We would need something multilateral right now between NATO member states and Russia in that regard to avoid the worst when it comes to accidents and certain military activities. There's still the OSCE Vienna document, because I think when we talk about risk, nuclear risk, it's impossible these days to look at it without addressing the conventional realm. So this is growing again together into one. At least from the viewpoint of risk. The OSCE Vienna document was last updated in 2011. It provides for certain notifications and inspections of military exercises, and Russia, since a couple of years, uses certain loopholes in the documents on ceilings in order not to notify certain military maneuvers by splitting up those maneuvers. And obviously in the current environment, it's also not implemented. We lost the INF Treaty, which is, I think, or was a terrible mistake by the Trump administration not to try harder, at least try. We lost the CFE Treaty through the adaptation process, and I think a lot of blame here rests on both sides. We lost the Open Skies Treaty, again by the Trump administration, could have been a useful transparency instrument. The NATO-Russia Founding Act seems to be dead, let's face it. I expect NATO to move a lot of more conventional forces than those so-called additional substantial combat forces that are supposed not to be stationed in the eastern countries of NATO. I expect NATO to do exactly that, to deploy substantial combat forces in large numbers in the next months. So that document seems to be dead, even though not officially yet. I don't know, I haven't heard of the NATO-Russia Council being used during that crisis. What about the OSCE? I think it's in the cards that Russia will also leave the OSCE. I hope not. That would, in my understanding, still be the ideal organization to deal with all these problems, because it's inclusive. Everyone has a seat at the table. It has a holistic understanding of what security means, not just state security, but individual security, security in an economic sense. The OSCE has already been on the ground with a special monitoring mission. So there are a number of institutions left, but I don't see any willingness from the Russian side to engage in those institutions. And of course, in hindsight, the losing of all these arms control instruments, I mean, that was a bellwether of what was coming. And a couple of us have warned about this since many, many years, but those warning signs were not heard of, were not heeded. And well, at some point we have to start from scratch.
Thank you for that, Uli. Nikolai, we have 3 minutes left. I give you the final word. Please.
I'll try, to do it in 3 minutes. I would say that control and confidence building measures are not intended as guardrails against escalation or to prevent escalation in a crisis. So it's simple as that. They are intended to stabilize the security situation, to stabilize military balance, to prevent each side from being able to wage a successful large-scale, I emphasize actual large-scale aggression. So that's basically it. So it's about predictability. I'm sorry. So yes.
Just be careful also that you don't touch your microphone, Nikolai. Otherwise, we can hear some interference.
Okay. Arms control enhances predictability and stability. When you talk about escalation during a crisis, the only real tool we have is hotlines. Yes, and we got some today. Yes, I agree with Uli. We'll need to restore the network of arms control and confidence building agreements so that we do not end up in the situation that we see today. Yes, that's really vital. At the end of the Cold War and shortly after the Cold War, we created a whole network of such agreements, and unfortunately, it has fallen apart. The current actual crisis is one of the consequences of that. I always said that we probably lost them because we, after the end of the Cold War, stopped fearing nuclear war. And I think that the current crisis actually brings back that fear and tells us that we were actually wrong to neglect the need to maintain and to strengthen arms control and confidence building regimes. We need to relearn the lesson from the Cold War. And that would be vital, but I do agree, actually, with Uli, I said the same thing. We do need to start thinking about the future. What happens after the end of the war? How do we build a new international system? One of actually the dangerous consequences will be the perception in the West. We've been right all along, and we will be right in the future, like forever. Well, mistakes were made by all sides, and we need to avoid these mistakes. And I would say that righteousness is a sin, and we need to avoid that sin. I think that it's easy now to see that Russia is wrong. Absolutely. The invasion says it all, but Russian invasion is not, will need proof that the West has been wrong. We do need some very serious thinking, some very serious forecasting, and it will not be easy, but we must do it.
Thank you for that, Nikolai. I'm very conscious of time. We have been together for 90 minutes. So let me just thank you very much, our two speakers, Dr. Ulrich Kühn from Hamburg and Dr. Nikolai Sokov, who joined us from Vienna, for your insightful analysis under these very concerning and pessimistic circumstances. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone in the audience for posing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna.